Our subject this morning, what to do when there's nothing you can do, or how to handle a desperate situation. We're reading from 2 Chronicles chapter 20, so everyone will stand please and we'll read together. The scriptures are printed in your bulletin. It came to pass after this also that the children of Moab, the children of Ammon, with them other beside the Ammonites, came against Jehoshaphat to battle.
Then Nebuchadnezzar before Jehoshaphat, saying, Their counsel of great multitude against thee, from beyond the sea beside Syria. And behold, they be in Hazazon, which is in Judea.
And Jehoshaphat feared and set himself to seek the Lord and proclaimed a fast throughout all Judah.
And Judah gathered themselves together to ask the help of the Lord.
Even out of the cities of
Judah they came to seek the Lord.
Thank you. Be seated, please. When a desperate situation comes your way, there are some things that you can do. If you're sick, you can go to a doctor. If you lose your job, you can find another. If you have a flat tire, you can take out the spare and continue on. If your house burns down, you can build another. Someone has written, for every evil under the sun, there is a remedy, or there is none. If there is one, seek till you find it. If there be none, never mind it. But there are some things we cannot ignore. There are things that are desperate, things that hurt, things that are coming our direction, and we don't know how to turn or which way to go. There are some situations that we cannot change. For example, if the state builds a freeway through your house, nothing you can do about that. You cannot stop a tornado. You cannot turn back the waters of a flood. You cannot save yourself. You cannot resurrect yourself from the grave. At times like this, we are tempted to try to take matters into our own hands. But we realize there are situations that sometimes will come to us in which there is nothing we can do. It is always wrong to try to be our own helper. When Israel came to the Red Sea, the mountains on each side, Pharaoh's army pursuing from behind, and the Red Sea before them, and there was nowhere to go. They were trapped, and Pharaoh's army was bearing down on them with the intent of destroying them all. And what could they do? There was nothing they could do. But Moses stood forth and said to them, Stand still and see the salvation of the Lord. Stand still. Spurgeon said, Stand still keeps the posture of an upright man, ready for action, expecting further orders. And it will not be long if he waits cheerfully and patiently for the directing voice that God will say to you as distinctly as he did to Moses and said it to the people of Israel, Go forward. And even though he spoke, Go forward, there was an ocean in front of them and an army behind them and nowhere to go. Now there are certain principles in this story that will help us in a desperate situation. And sooner or later, if you haven't already, you will have such a situation. They do develop. As much as we don't like them, sometimes they come. And what do we mean when we speak about a desperate situation? We mean something that's out of our hands, something that's beyond our control. We can't do anything about it. Such as grief, or a trial, or an affliction, or a marital conflict, or an illness. Many, many different conflicts sometimes come our way. And it would be a situation where we would have to say, I have no hope whatsoever. There is nothing I can do. And when a situation like that comes your way, always remember, there's one thing left that you can do. You can pray. You can pray. That's the only thing you can do. And that was the situation in the days of King Jehoshaphat. King Jehoshaphat received word that 3 great armies and some others were coming on their way to Jerusalem to destroy the inhabitants of Jerusalem. And he had a very small army. He was outnumbered 3 or 4 to 1. He knew he could not fight that army. He knew he could not win that battle. So what did he do? He took himself to prayer. And we read in chapter 20 and verse 1, it came to pass after this also, that the children of Moab, the children of Ammon, with them other besides the Ammonites, came against Jehoshaphat to battle. And there came some that told Jehoshaphat, saying, there cometh a great multitude against thee. This invasion actually took place, we learn from the history books, in 85 BC. Judah is outnumbered 3 to 1. The impending attack is nearing Jerusalem. In fact, they were only 20 miles away from Jerusalem. Jehoshaphat's control was nil. There was nothing he could do. So what did he do? He sought the Lord. Notice verse 3. And Jehoshaphat feared and set himself to seek the Lord, and proclaimed a fast throughout all Judah. And Judah gathered themselves together to ask help of the Lord. Even out of all the cities of Judah, they came to seek the Lord. Somebody said, the devil can wall you around, but he can't roof you in. You can always go up through the roof to God in prayer. Annie Johnson Flint wrote this little poem. Have you come to a Red Sea place in your life where in spite of all that you can do, there is no way out and there's no way back? There's no other way but through. Then wait on the Lord with a trust serene till the night of your fear is gone. He will send the wind. He will heap the floods when he says to your soul, go on. And your fears shall pass as your foes have passed. And you shall be no more afraid. You shall sing his praise in a better place, a place that his hand has made. Faith is better than doubt. Now let's look at Jehoshaphat's prayer. In Isaiah chapter 41 and verse 21, he had a justification for his prayer. The Lord gives us this word. Produce your cause, saith the Lord. Bring forth your strong reasons, saith the King of Jacob. In other words, God says, come, let us reason together. Let's talk about this. Come to me in prayer. Let's talk it over. Tell me your problem. I want to help you. And so here's the prayer that he prayed. In verse 6, He said, O Lord God of our fathers, art thou not God in heaven? He acknowledged God dwelt in heaven. And then he said also, and rulest not thou over all the kingdoms of the heathen? He knew that God was ruling in power. He said, and in thine hand there is power and might. He acknowledged that God had all power. God was omnipotent. And then he said, so that none is able to stand thee. None can withstand thee. Then in verse 7 through 9, he acknowledged that God was their God. He said in verse 7, art thou not our God, who didst drive out the inhabitants of this land before thy people Israel, and gavest it to the seed of Abraham, thy friend forever? He's reminding God of how God had worked in the past to deliver Israel, to give them the promised land. Then he said in verse 8, have you not built a house for your name to dwell in? And they dwelt therein, and have built thee a sanctuary therein for thy name, saying, when evil cometh upon us, as the sword, judgment, or pestilence, or famine, we stand before this house, and in thy presence, for thy name is in this house, and cry unto thee in our affliction. Then thou wilt hear and help. He speaks of the house of God, which in that day was the Old Testament tabernacle. And he said this house of God is the place where we're going to stand. And standing before this house of God, we're going to call upon the Lord for help. You know, the house of God is a good place to send your prayer up from. You can pray anywhere, but praying in church is a good place to pray. Verse 9, evil cometh upon us. Verse 10, and now, behold, the children of Ammon, and Moab, and Mount Seir, whom thou wouldest not let Israel invade, when they came out of the land of Egypt. But they, Israel, turned from them, the three nations, and destroyed them not. Now, Israel spared these three nations, the Ammonites, the Moabites, and the Edomites, those of Mount Seir. They asked permission to march through their land, and they refused permission. And so they went all the way around a long way because they would not grant permission. And now, having spared them, they realized that their enemy that they spared is now coming to destroy them. Now, Jehoshaphat recognized that he had a problem. And whenever you have a problem, you need to recognize it. Don't bury your head in the sand and become blind to it like the ostrich. But recognize your problem. And then take that problem to the Lord. He's the one that can handle it. Notice he summarized their helplessness and their dependence in verse 12. O our God, wilt thou not judge them? For we have no might against this great company that cometh against us, neither know we what to do, but our eyes are upon thee. We're looking to you, Lord. And all Judah stood before the Lord with their little ones and their wives and their children. All of Judah gathered together. The children, the wives, they all prayed together. And whenever a church prays in unison and prays in unity, there's great power in such a prayer. That's why if you have a need, bring it before the Lord in the house of God and ask the brethren to pray with you. God will hear. He will answer. He takes great stock in what's done in His house. And then he did something else. He went and sat down and bowed his head, and he prayed and he reflected on the sovereignty of God. In verse 5 and 6, and Jehoshaphat stood in the congregation of Judah and Jerusalem in the house of the Lord before the new court. And he said, O Lord God of our fathers, art thou not God in heaven? Rulest thou not over the kingdoms of the heathen? And in thine hand is there not power and might, so that none is able to withstand thee? He's reminding God that he believes in the sovereignty of God. He believes that God is all-powerful, almighty, that he can do anything that he chooses to do. He rests in the sovereignty of God. And whenever a problem comes your way and you pray, make sure you're resting in the sovereignty of God, knowing that God is sovereign. He can do anything. He can turn the king's heart like a river. There's nothing God cannot do. What do we mean by divine sovereignty? In Daniel chapter 4 and verse 35, Daniel put it like this, that God is the absolute and sole ruler of the universe. And he said in verse 35, and all the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing, and he doeth according to his will in the army of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth, and none can stay his hand or say unto him, what doest thou? Who is the one that can go to God and say, what are you doing here? What right do you have to do this? And though God uses means to accomplish his will most of the time, he's not totally dependent